Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. In our first video from Astrology Day titled Honoring the Lineage, the Transmission of Astrology Through History, we're zipping all the way back in time to the wonderful world of ancient astrology, presented by the one and only Demetra George and esteemed astrologer Kenneth Miller. And lastly, if you wish to view our current class, workshop and webinar offerings, please visit KeplerCollege.org. And without further ado, let's get into the video. Jumping back into our time machine for our final presentations of today, we're going zipping all the way back to the wonderful world of ancient astrology. And our brilliant presenters today, Demetra George. Demetra is a pioneering mythic archetypal astrologer who studies and translates Greek astrological texts, as well as the transmission of classical doctrines into the Arabic and medieval worlds. Recipient of the Regulus Award, her work provides the keys to understanding all forms of traditional astrology. Author of 6 brilliant books, her most recent is The Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice, a Manual of Traditional Techniques, Volumes 1 and 2. And for those, go and find out more about Demetra at demetrageorge.com.
Yes, and Demetra actually was one of the people who was the first to bring Hellenistic astrology to the world, and certainly to KeplerCollege as an instructor back in the days of our degree program, which was where we also found Kenneth Miller. He earned his MA in Eastern and Western Traditions, the History, Philosophy, and Transmission of Astrology from KeplerCollege. And he is most known for his Vedic astrology. He attended the American College of Vedic Astrology, where he achieved a level 2 certification, is a certified Jyotish Kovid from the Council of Vedic Astrology, has a BA in Anthropology, Psychology, and Religious Studies from the University of Colorado. He's been with us for a long time, the former president of KeplerCollege. He's hosted many of these astrology days, and he's served on various astrological organization boards, including CVA, ESAR, NCGR, and SDAS. In addition to Indian astrology, Kenneth has studied modern astrology with Helena Elizabeth Rano, Hellenistic astrology with Demetra and Robert Schmidt, medieval astrology with Robert Zoller, and Renaissance astrology with Lee Lehman. So he's very well-rounded in his education, and one is the few professional astrologers that has studied all of these traditions. So we always welcome both Demetra and Kenneth's perspective, and we're delighted to have them together in the same room where they can hash things out. So we're in our little time warp again. I think there's a song coming on here, but we will let
you can start dancing.
Yeah, that's right. We'll do the time warp again.
So I'm here to basically ride on Demetra's coattails. So take it away, Demetra.
Well, when Kenneth and I were discussing this presentation, we thought we would make it a little less formal as a discussion between us, and also being able to take questions from the audience. So I would just like to begin with picking up on a word that Jen used about the multiplicities of astrologies. And to say that in going back, tracing it back as far as we are able to, based on whatever material evidence there is, or testimony or stories of oral transmission, we see that astrology arose simultaneously and independently in the cultures of Egypt and in Mesopotamia, in India, and in China. And if we broaden our view of the meaning of astrology to connecting with the movements of the planetary bodies, and those movements having some sort of relevance to what occurs in the lives of humans and on Earth, then we can hold the container for all of the initial celestial observations. The Egyptians, prior to 2000 BC, actually around 2500 BC, had charted the 36 decan stars that rose through each of the hours of the night, and every 10 days over the course of the year. They were inscribed on the inside of coffin lids to assist the dead in their timing for their prayers and the journey through the underworld. So we have a ritualistic use of a connection with the stars that were also later identified with different gods. In Mesopotamia, again, 2300 BC, we have the first earliest lunar eclipse omens that were inscribed on clay tablets, where the visual phenomena associated with eclipses was recorded, and there were indications for the fate of the king. And then in India, Kenneth, why don't you say that that's very early time, what was going on?
So the Indian historical record is a bit more spotty because they wrote on leaves and bark that didn't withstand the tests of time. We have some things written on stone pillars, which we may get to later in the hour. So whenever we look at the history of things, at least initially, at least when I started in this work, it seemed like the Indian side of the equation was often short shrifted because a lot of evidence just didn't, physically survive. But we do know that the ancient Indian peoples were a star watching culture. In the Vedas, which is the holy books of what we now call Hinduism, they do mention the lunar mansions, the nakshatras. They mention the starting of it being what is now the third nakshatra, Kritika, and that dates to let's see, I think I have my notes somewhere, but like 2400 BCE. So we know they were, looking at the sky, and we know that the earliest strata of astrology was timing religious rituals, and that, each section of the sky was associated with a particular Vedic deity, and the timing of rituals. This is probably the very earliest strata. And you have a couple of time periods where there's an exchange of potentially an exchange of information between cultures, and you have trade between ancient Mesopotamia and India, so that some of their omen literature comes down to India. And then you have the later, like, Hellenistic Empire interacting with India. And we'll talk more about that when we get a little further down the time stream. And then there's a big question mark in all this, which is the Indus Valley civilization, which thrived at the time of ancient Babylon, but we cannot decipher their writing. They had a sophisticated cities, and it's still a big mystery. So one day when we kind of crack that code, and if we find more literature from that civilization, that might also like open a lot of things up in terms of when people learned what. But as Demetra said, almost all traditional civilizations were looking up at the sky and finding meaning in them.
Yes.
And it's just, what I find interesting is that the notion of horoscopic astrology, it doesn't really matter who was the first one to like think of that. It takes root in both cultures immediately and thrives in both cultures for reasons we'll get into hopefully shortly. Okay, I feel like I talked too much now.
No, that was good, because I have a few comments on your comments. First of all, I just also want to add that there was a whole development of Chinese astrology at a very early time period. And I'm not familiar with that tradition hardly at all, but I know it exists. So yet in another part of the world, there was a whole connection with the sky and meaning from the sky. And we'll see later how those intertwine together. A second comment I had on what you said, Kenneth, was when you were talking about the early teachings being on palm leaves that disintegrated, but there is also a very strong oral tradition.
Yes.
That we shouldn't negate as being non-evidential. And I think about a section in one of Plato's dialogues. I want to say it's the Phaedrus, but I can't be positive, where someone comes up and they say, oh my goodness, we've just discovered the Egyptians have invented this writing system, like the hieroglyphs. Isn't this the most wonderful thing imaginable? And the interlocutor in Plato's dialogue says, oh my goodness, like this is awful. Now people are going to lose the art of memory. And so I know that from my studies in the Buddhist tradition, the importance not only of the oral lineages, but of the person receiving the teaching from their teacher, learning to repeat it or know it exactly word for word, that was part of the training, was this incredible memorization so that it could be passed on in an authentic and accurate way, and that being a great source of pride. So when people say, oh, well, you just can't say it was an oral transmission and use that as evidence, it is not understanding the values of the culture that was holding the set of teachings and what they thought was more important. And then the third comment, then we'll get into this, is that there was tremendous trade and travel going on between the ancient cultures, much more than we would suspect unless we start doing the research. So we can't just isolate each culture and say, okay, this was only Egyptian, or this was only Indian, or this was only Babylonian, because as people move about with their goods, they talk, right? They're, you know, and in the talking, there is the exchange of ideas. And just because I hear about the ideas of some other kind of astrology that I find fascinating and they influence my thinking, but I might not in my writings exactly mention the techniques that were spoken about, but the ideas were influential, then later scholars in the future going back and saying, oh, there was no transmission because we don't see evidence of this particular technique. Again, that is not an altogether legitimate conclusion to make. So those are some things I wanted to put out in this discussion. Okay. I'll turn it back over to you.
Someone just wrote a very long question in here. The Indus Valley civilization, how do we think their astrology emerged? Well, I mean, those are all unknown questions because we just really don't know anything about them. Because the ecology of their environment changed dramatically, and it appears that their cities had to be abandoned, and we don't really even know why they disappeared. One theory is they, move into India for greener pastures. So I don't, and I'm not an expert on this, the latest coming out of archaeology and anthropology in the Indus Valley civilization. So, but, who knows what astrology they were doing, because we can't read anything that they've left behind. So sorry, I can't give a better answer.
We do have another question here, if you don't mind, that showed up in the chat. Do you think we are anywhere near a holistic understanding of how the terms, bounds, confines were actually used in Hellenistic chart delineation, or is this still very much a work in progress?
Okay, so I'm just reading the question here. Do we know how the bounds were used in Hellenistic chart delineation? Yes, we do. One very important timing technique is the name that we are now using for it, although this isn't an exact transliteration of the Hellenistic text, are circumambulations through the bounds. I think Ben uses the word directions through the bounds instead of circumambulations. But a planet that is considered to hold or represent the greatest source of the life force in the chart is released at the time of birth. And as it moves through the various bounds, which are unequal divisions of each signs, the planet that is the ruler or lord of that bound becomes the time lord for the period of time that that planet, through whatever increment of time one is using to move it, and whatever it represents in the natal chart, then those significations become manifest during that time of life. And so that is one of the more important uses of the bounds, particularly connected with length of life and vitality inquiries. And then also the bounds were one form of a planet's rulerships. So if a planet was in a particular chart located in its own bounds, it gave it a tremendous amount of power, especially a power of autonomy, because it wasn't subject to someone else's oversight or rules. Firmicus Macturna said that a planet in its own bounds was as powerful as a planet in its own domicile. So those are two examples of how the bounds were used in Hellenistic interpretation.
That reminds me of how in the earliest literature, surviving literature, how the divisional placements of planets will modify the interpretation of one's natal chart. So for those who aren't familiar, Indian astrology has a whole bunch of what we call divisional charts that are based on dividing the zodiac into, or the space of a zodiacal sign into 9, 7, 5. I mean, there's a whole bunch. And they all have specific meanings. But when I was going through the kind of earliest strata of Indian astrology literature that's been translated into English, it'll often say, you know, this planet in this sign, you know, has a certain effect. But if it's in this section, you know, and it kind of reminded me of the way bounds are used. If it's in this section, if it's in its own Navamsha or the ninth division of one of these other places, it makes it better. This makes it worse, and it adds a layer of understanding.
Right, and that's also the idea behind the division of each sign into 3 decans. Each decan that was later given a planetary ruler. It's like being broken down into smaller and smaller and more subtle refinements. There is, you know, in the aftermath of Hellenistic astrology being introduced to the Kepler students, and as the ramifications of that went out into the community, and now a new generation of astrologers is coming of age with a lot of the Hellenistic principles as their foundational teachings. They're doing amazing work going forward. So I've recently looked at someone's analysis of the dodecamori, which are the, again, divisions of each sign into 12 parts, and the discussion of how, and Joey Cannizzaro showed me his work, the idea of this being of fractals of a hologram. And I suggested that that's also a similar, not identical, but a similar concept in zodiacal releasing, where you have 4 levels, and the first level goes through each of the signs for so many years, and then each of that sector divides it up again through the signs for smaller increments of time. So that, while not an identical technique to the way divisionals are used in the Vedic astrology, the concept of finer and finer divisions and ramifications for bringing forth more subtle and specific meaning is common to the various traditions.
Someone asked the dates of the Indus Valley civilization, and roughly they were 2700 to the mid 17s BCE.
Okay,
So there you go.
right. And I have read that in Mesopotamia, there were cuneiform inscriptions talking about trade relations between one of the kings in Mesopotamia and rulers in the Indus Valley. So we know that that is one and a very early point of interaction between those cultures. And to the extent that they were both stargazing cultures that by that time, I'm thinking that the whole Venus tablets had already been written, as well as some of the other planetary tablets. And of course, people who love astrology, when they find other people that know anything about astrology, like you can't hardly stop talking. So I just like to suggest that in the same way we have that passionate conversation, that certainly existed whenever those connections were made.
There are other questions. I don't know if I should jump into from Scott. How many aspects of Hellenistic astrology were prefigured by the Sumerians? Or are you familiar with the recent research of Rumen Kolev?
I am not familiar, Scott, with the recent research. However, it's like wonderful you say this, because I've been doing some research into early Babylonian astrology last week for some other projects I have going on, and went digging in my boxes for my books by Roshberg and Ulrich Westenholz. And lo and behold, oh, can you see my screen? Can anyone see my screen? Right, here's the book I found by Rumen on the Babylonian astronomy and astrology. And I remember when Rumen came to KeplerCollege, and we're at the Comfort Inn and sitting at the table, and he was just there and selling this book, and I bought it. And I had no idea I had it tucked away. So I was thrilled to find it. However, Scott, are those two questions related? Has Rumen been doing work on, what was your question on Sumerian techniques in Hellenistic astrology?
Hold on, it was moved to another section of the.
Okay.
Where is it? How many aspects? Okay, I think he doesn't mean aspects. He means how many concepts of Hellenistic astrology were prefigured by the Sumerians.
Well, when you
Am I
say
capturing the spirit, Scott, of your question?
Okay. When you say the Sumerians, you have to be very careful. Because basically, they came from somewhere else and were the rulers of Mesopotamia in the area where southern Iraq is now. And by the 2100, 2200 BCE, they began to be superseded by other tribes of the Akkadians and then the Babylonians. And we're talking about a 2,000-year period of different cultures being the rulers in that large area of the ancient Near East, where astrology developed from initial observations and very simple comments to really 2,000 years later, before they had the first horoscope, that a child born on such and such a day had planets and the sign and the prognosis that things will be good for you. So I don't know if you mean Sumerian. I don't know how much that would be, unless one is looking at the rising and setting of planets on the horizon. And those were two very important points for the initial observations of astrology in the ancient Near East, which we give the blanket word Babylonian to, but really the word Babylonian needs to be expanded to Akkadian, to Assyrian, and then even work that was done during the Persian period and into the Seleucid and Parthian period that stretched over, as I said, a 2,000-year basis.
Okay, let me move the timetable a little bit forward because I want to talk about something that used to be brought up a lot when the people who would argue that the Indians learned everything from the Greeks, they would point to an early astrology text book called the Yavana Jataka, which is often translated as the astrology of the Greeks. And it was dated one of the earliest surviving texts we have on astrology, although that date has now been called in question. But one of the things I often see a different when scholars of astrology approach things, when they have a Western source, they tend to assume the earliest date, or they act as if the earliest date is the solid one. And when they look at the Indian stuff, they always go to the latest date. So that's just a bias I've noticed in the field that hopefully is changing now, but just be aware of that when you see these like date spreads. But any event, as many of you know, Alexander the Great conquered a whole bunch of territory and came right up to India, and then turned around. But left a bunch of little colonies in India. And these are a population called the which are now called the Indo-Greeks. And so that the emperor of India that then later unified almost all of what we now call India and beyond. And this is the time period like around 300 BCE. Wait, where was I going with this? Oh, he so the Indo-Greeks were viewed, they weren't really part of the traditional caste system. They weren't part of the traditional class system. They were kind of outside that. But this emperor sort of made a legal proclamation that was okay for them to marry native Indians. And so they very quickly assimilate within a few hundred years into Indian culture. But there is talk about them, and these people are called Yavanas. So anyone that would have had kind of an Indo-Greek lineage would have been called Yavanas. And so this early textbook called the Yavana Jataka, well, first of all, let's note that the second word of that book is Jataka, which is the word for horoscopic astrology. So you're thinking, well, wait a minute, why didn't they borrow that word if they're borrowing other Greek words to describe astrology? There must have been some kind of native astrology going on to differentiate this kind from other kinds. And but it looks like these Indo-Greeks that were now marrying in and adopting culture, and Buddhism was a lot more prominent in India this time, and that Buddhist philosophy was seemingly very appealing to the Greek minds as well. They just take on all these cultural things, and there is so much Indian astrology in the earliest texts that has nothing to do with Hellenistic astrology. Whatever were the very earliest texts just don't survive, or at least we haven't found them yet, because what we have is already something that is dialing in Indian deities, Indian beliefs. It's just like it's all through this text. And what's great about ancient authors is they do often frequently quote from people before them. And so when we get to like the 500s, where Varamihira, probably the most famous astrologer that we have like a historical date for, he writes books that are translated through the ages, and to this day you can get several different English translations of his works. He quotes a whole bunch of authors and ideas that we don't have the actual source for anymore. So that's always the problem of astrology, is we have very few. I mean, imagine 1,000 years from now, if the two surviving books are, Llewellyn George Horoscope Delineator, and I don't know, something from Mark Edmund Jones, and then you're trying to construct, what was going on in the 20th century.
Right.
So that's kind of how we are. And I think with all this stuff, we have to hold on to it loosely, because we're just one manuscript away from like rewriting what was, happening when.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the Bactrians. Yeah, so I want to push back that a little bit.
Sure.
That before Alexander the Great conquered that area, the Persians had expanded to the into the Indus Valley. And when I was rereading Pingree's article, he was talking about, at that point, like 500 to 300 BC, that there were documented some elements of Babylonian astrology that had filtered into at least Indian astronomy. And that was like one place where you could trace a line of transmission. And then after Alexander conquered and left, as you said, some of his Greeks stayed behind and formed the Bactrian Empire. That was a Greek-ruled empire, but butted up against the western edge of India, and that many of the people formed this, as you said, a Greco-Indian, Indian-Greco culture, where they learned each other's languages, they intermarried, they shared customs, and that one of the things that astrologers do when they inherit a tradition that has existed before them is that they often reframe it according to the traditions and values of the culture they're in. So it has relevance to the lives of the people who are using this information to make meaning of their lives. And so that may have been one of the processes involved in the Yavana Jataka, right, was this intermingling of the two traditions out of a peoples that had been intermingling and intermarrying for several centuries. And then after the Bactrians, that empire fell apart around 1st century AD, if I remember correctly. And the next rulers of that area were called the Sakas, who were the Scythians, who came from Central Asia. And I've become recently fascinated with the silk routes, the Silk Roads. And in that time period, there were Manichaeans. Their prophet Mani was born in Iran, and they were astrologers. St. Augustine's mother was a Manichaean, where she learned astrology, and Augustine studied it for a time. But they traveled across the Silk Roads, established temples in China, and that some of their goods and ideas through the Sogdian merchants likewise came down into India, because they were the overlords at that time. And so we have another place of the transmission of the teachings, not only coming from one place to another, but then again returning from India through the same trade routes as influencing places where the traders then went to. So we have tremendous movement in the early centuries CE, late centuries BC, early centuries BC, through the Bactrians, through the Scythians, And then also with the Egyptians, where trade routes opened up with ships going across the Indian Ocean on account of the discovery of the trade winds. And I think, Kenneth, you've done some discovery of colonies of Indians that were established in Egypt during this time period. I remember that from there's a curry in your feta talk that you gave.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be more accurate to say I presented that information that other scholars have dug up. But yeah, there
Right,
is
for us, it was
evidence.
the revelation.
Yes, there is evidence of, and by evidence, I mean there's like funeral sites clearly of Indians in Alexandria at the time that astrology was a
Yeah.
hotbed. So clearly people were trading, and foreigners talked about. We have foreign sources that talk about the Indian trading ships. And one of the things I often mention, when you get into the history of astrology, it's very easy to just lock yourself into the texts and lock yourself into astrology and astronomy. But with this ancient stuff, you really have to widen your gaze and look at what is art history doing? What is coin history doing?
Yeah.
What is the mathematical? There are a lot of debates that could be answered if someone picked up a book on the history of mathematics in the region, because there are scholars working on that. So there are all these like adjacent fields that impinge on what we do. And one of the things is spice trade. So black pepper that we all know and love originated in South India, but it is found everywhere. And that's how we know that trading was going on from a very early date, because we find Indian only spices in the far reaches of places. And we have later when Rome conquers Alexandria, we have the Romans complaining about all the money they're spending on Indian spices. That's like draining the coffers of the empire. But yes, there were these Indo-Greek, almost like, in addition to Bactria, there were these sort of Indo-Greek city-states, I guess we would call them, that dot the coast of India. And even in Tamil Nadu, which is a section of India on the east side, they talk about the, the customs of the Indo-Greeks and how they're like living in their towns and stuff like that. So there was a lot of potential conversations happening.
Right. One piece of research I would love to do, but I hope that someone else does it. But when we went to Tamil Nadu, to the different planetary temples there, that my understanding was that the timing was somewhere around 1000 CE, that those temples were initially built and practiced. And there were conversations about if there are any links with Haran, that was in southern Turkey, northern Syria, around that time, where there are also said to be temples to the planetary gods that were worshipped. And that would have been like 7, 8, 9, 1000 CE. And so the emergence of those two traditions at about the same time period just begs for someone to see if you can find connecting threads between those. Are you going to write that down, Kenneth?
No, that is
okay. I'm going to get on that.
But it reminded me of when I was like reviewing all my materials of this stuff. There is a text that survives, a Sanskrit text that survives, that's from the early centuries of this era. And it's like a social code and like family law and behavior and stuff like that. It's not about astrology per se, but in there it does mention that, oh yeah, the planets can really mess up your life and you need to worship them. And it gives the rationale of like worshiping the planets. So that concept, goes way back, that there's an importance to propitiating planets, and it the fact that it makes that comment almost offhandedly speaks to, well, then people must have known that they were, in the sky and somehow influencing them. So So you have that kind of circumstantial evidence at the periphery.
Right. Well, that so moves on to a question I saw at some point in the box, but I don't see it right now. About, oh, here it is. The mindset or point of view regarding fate and free will.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they say between Hellenistic and Vedic astrology. But let's start with the Mesopotamian astrology, because the planets were understood to be one of the appearances of the gods. And when they would rise or culminate or be in certain positions, it was as if the god appeared and the god was stating their intention for humanity. But if the astrologer priests who are interpreting these omens said, oh, this is really bad, there was a series of rituals that could be done called the Namburbi rituals that were transactional offerings between humans and gods, almost like saying, like to the judge, hey, is this really like the sentence you want to give me? Like, let me explain my situation a little bit more. Can I get you to change your mind? And so that there was this fluid interaction between the decrees of the planetary gods and the extent to whether they were negotiable or non-negotiable in human lives through rituals. So we would say in the Mesopotamian astrology that fate was not altogether fixed because one could negotiate. Now, you see those kinds of rituals, I believe, in the Vedic astrology, and I'll let you talk about that. But you also see it in the Hellenistic world with the tradition of astral magic, where rituals were done to a certain planet at the time and on the day and the rising of a certain planet with the gathering of, if it was Venus, for roses and apples and other Venusian substances. And so we again see that fate was not fixed, but was negotiable. But, and this is the important but, that can only occur when you hold a view that the planets contain some sort of sentient intelligence. Because if the planets are totally dead, inert masses, then how can you communicate with something that is not a thinking, conscious, sentient entity? So how you think about the divinity of the cosmos plays a great part in the rationality of your belief that you can interact with it. So I'm wondering, like in the Vedic philosophy, how that was conceptualized.
Okay, I will answer that question, but I want to step back a little bit just to
Okay.
emphasize something Demetra said, because I remember when I started Kepler, now this is back when Kepler was an academic institution, and I was in Nick Campion's History of Astrology. And so this is many years ago, before he wrote his books. And he said, gee, you know, the Mesopotamians, they were like looking at the sky and they were taking all these notes. It seems strange that they didn't, you know, it took so long for someone to think of like doing a horoscope. And that gave me an idea. And my term paper for that class was demonstrating that the fate concept helped anchor astrology into the Greco-Hellenistic culture, because it only makes sense to have a horoscope if you believe that there is some fate at work. And Stoicism, which was, you know, very popular at the dawn of horoscopic astrology in the West, you know, hard Stoicism said that everything repeated, everything was fated. And the reason why you wanted to know what was going to happen is so you could approach life with equanimity, because that's the best you could do. Then as you get into what I'll call soft Stoicism, I'm sure Ben Dykes, if he's here, would be like spinning around how I'm misrepresenting all this. But broadly speaking, you get this notion of, yeah, there are things that are fated, but there you do have some wiggle room in terms of how you react to things and that. So at the same time, the karma we know and love today was not the well-developed thing in India, and it was just sort of developing the karma theory that was connected to rebirth and stuff like that. And so again, horoscopic astrology, of course we want to do this. So, you know, everyone wants to know what their karma is. Maybe the slight difference is that you do have currently generated karma, right? So the horoscope, you know, anyone that starts studying Indian astrology now, you know, in the 21st century, you will be taught at the beginning that according to the karma theory behind astrology, you've lived several lives, you've generated a bunch of karma, and I'm assuming everyone knows kind of what karma means. And a certain portion, let's say you've lived 1,000 lives and you've generated, let's get my hands in the screen, this much karma. Well, only maybe this much is going to be allotted to this particular life. And that is what the chart is showing. What it's not showing is how are you reacting to that? What are you generating now? You know, this is, and there are intelligences behind the planets that are delivering this karma. So yes, you can propitiate them and be mindful and develop an equanimity. But now the equanimity is to be a little more non-reactive to the stuff that happens in your life so that you mute the karma. And I can go off on more tangents on this, but I will reel it in by saying that there is this notion that what you're doing now generates a kind of counterforce to what you brought in with you. And that's one, it's not the only way to look at a horoscope, but that is one way to look at it. And I just want to quote, probably misquote, Bob Zoller, who was a medieval, you know, kind of reintroduced medieval astrology to English speakers. And he said something to the effect, and Demetra, maybe you remember this quote better than me, that yeah, there is fate, there is a free will, but how much free will you have is determined by your chart. You know? Like some people have more free will than other people.
Right. Even though you think you made that choice, it actually was already predetermined in your chart that you would choose that one over that. Yes, and you see this conflict in the Hellenistic work between the Hermetic astrology that was filled with rituals and the gathering of substances and plants and stones and mitigations that, and Lines and Valens, who is very much a Stoic, he said, forget it, like no amount of prayers or sacrifices or any of that is going to alter the fate of the chart. So they were dealing with these same issues in a way that apparently were not fully resolved because we're still dancing between the two.
Well, and we have Western religious imperative that, at least in the Christian model, requires the free choice to choose the Christian savior. And so then you get this split. Now, this is way beyond hundreds, thousands of years beyond the time period we're talking about now, where it's like, well, astrology is okay to maybe predict weather and medical stuff that happens to the body, but we don't want it mucking around in the mind and the decision-making process. But we definitely, as modern astrologers, I mean, what is modern psychological astrology other than attributing, you know, astrological symbols, if not influences, to character traits?
I'm jumping way back, and my comment right now is very indirectly connected to this, but one question is, why did it take the Mesopotamians 2,000 years to go from omen astrology, where you're making prognostications for the king and the crops and wars, to this notion that you can look at the position of the planets when a person is born and make prognostications about their character and their fate or destiny. Why did that take 2,000 years to move from one to the other? And one idea that's been put forth is that in this earlier time period, in the Mesopotamian belief that the purpose of humans was to serve the gods. And therefore, it was of value to know what the gods wanted so you could do what they wanted because that was your purpose to do, take care of them. It took that long for the notion that individuals might have had, that people may have had an individual destiny that was not only that of serving the gods. And it may have been when that dawning realization reached some sort of collective level that this notion of the individual horoscope came into place. And there could be like, it's not an unreasonable idea because that's also one of the ideas behind the development of humanism in the Renaissance was all of a sudden humans became the center of the picture rather than the divine after 1,000 years of medieval Christian theology. So when humans, the role or the purpose of the individual human comes into place, then that opens up like, what is human responsibility in making, in right action, in deciding to do right action in one's life. You know, one of my Tibetan teachers said, you want to know who you're going to be in your future life? Like, look at your present actions.
Yes. We're nearing the end of the hour. Someone asked a very poignant question that's completely off topic, but I want to devote a minute to answer it. How can you use your natal chart to understand the trauma passed on from every lineage to gain perspective where you need to be able to heal? If I understand that correctly, yes. I mean, if you're the type of person that needs to sort of understand or have a reason why certain things are the way they are, astrology is very good at giving you an answer to that. Now, whether that answer is true or fiction, you know, who knows? I mean, we all are believers of astrology here, but I think any astrologer can help someone understand, in theory, if they're a good astrologer, can help someone understand, you know, what you're referring to as trauma, at least the astrological piece of that. I know in Indian astrology, there is a whole set, we don't talk about it out loud often in the West, but there is a whole section of like ancestral problems. And I remember when I was in India getting a reading, the guy was like, oh yeah, your father, you know, did this thing and da-da-da. And I was like, what the F? This doesn't mean, and it actually ended up to be all true. It was something I didn't know about that had happened in the family, but apparently I was carrying a piece of that as this family karma that, you know, from the ancestors that now in my generation, you know, I needed to do something about it. So yes, there's all kinds of esoteric things that, you know, one can get into with astrology. I don't think you have to have astrology to heal from trauma, but if you have the kind of mind that needs to anchor it into something, astrology can be that anchor.
Right. There is some work going on now with what they call transgenerational trauma and how that shows up in the natal chart. And the initial suggestions are obviously the moon, the fourth house, the ruler of the fourth house, having to do with ancestral and familial lineage. But a piece of scientific research is that they found that someone like the Holocaust victims can experience the trauma, and that creates a change in their DNA. And that change in the DNA, even like 6 to 10 or 12 years later, if at that point they conceive a child, gets transferred from their DNA to the child's DNA, which again can get transferred for 2 more generations. And I wish I had the name of that article, but the person who asked that, I'm sure if you put in the right words in a Google search, you can track that down. And so that's a very interesting correlate of how transgenerational trauma can get passed on physically through the DNA, and then to try and correlate that with the significators of family and ancestors in the chart.
Yeah, psychologist was actually telling me about this research. So I think it's very easy to find. If you do key in those words, you can get access to it. And it's fascinating stuff for sure.
I think we're at our time. Is that true, Callum?
Wow.
I wish we could go on for hours.
It flies by, that's for sure. I'm going to invite all of our presenters to turn on their cameras. Too bad that Benjamin couldn't stay for us, but if anybody wants to, I would like to take a screenshot of everybody who's still here. Is owner still here? I thought he was.
What time is it in Turkey now?
Yeah, right. Anyway, I'm going to take a screenshot. Everybody smile.
I love all the hearts and the claps coming through.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. A round of applause, and I'm sure everyone is watching.
Thank you so much. There's so much to learn,
wow.
isn't there?
Oh, owner, here he is.
Oh yeah. Oh, do it again. Lori, turn your camera on.
Ta-da.
Oh. Yeah, there should be a Demetra Kenneth show, and we just listen to you guys talk for hours.
Well, I would include all of you in that. We've learned so much here today.
Well, it's been a real honor, and thank you, KeplerCollege, which was so important to my own development, and it's nice to come back at this.
To come home, Kenneth.
There is a question in the question box. It's actually a very specific delineation question, which is way beyond the scope of what we're doing. But, I always like to answer the questions that are in the question box. And someone's asking, if Mars stations partile on one's part of fortune, do you think there is any way to avoid severe damage or death? And my answer to that would be yes, I do believe there is a way. So, but we don't really have time to discuss it.
We'll leave you with that.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, no, I don't mean to minimize your question. I know that's very serious, but I mean, but a short answer would be give Mars a place to express itself. So it's not affecting your body if you're taking the part of fortune as body.
Who wrote the book on Mars?
Yes.
One of them.
A book.
Yeah. No, but that's a good
I'm
point.
going to
That
be quiet
into
now. Put
your planets where they go.
Yeah, I'd just like to add my gratitude and joy at being part of this a discussion today. And also, it's like coming home as being part of the first faculty at KeplerCollege and teaching that history of astrology program for a number of years. And for the people who are still listening, that these are the kinds of discussions that can happen with the study of the history. So I urge everyone to take the courses that are out there and through multiple places right now, and to learn the lineage that belongs to you. This is like your birthright, and that you should claim it and discover the fascination and the richness and the profundity of the tradition you've inherited.
Some of the weirdness.
And some of the weirdness.
We live in a culture that
Indeed.
if it gets published in a book, it's true. And there are, especially, I shouldn't say especially, but I've noticed it in Western astrology, something will become doctrine, and it's because someone, published a crazy idea 30 years ago, and people are like, oh, okay, I like this. And then it becomes.
So what are you saying? Get writing?
But the juicy stuff's in the journals, because I came across an issue of Isar's Cosmos or something that had this report about Howard Sassperdas in the pool at UAC. in New Orleans. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, history repeats itself. I was at a pool in UAC in New Orleans in 2012, but here we're talking about the 80s. And I'm like, this is crazy. And like, you hear all these stories and, you know, it's in the more ephemeral literature too, that like, they're people just like us, you know, doing their astrology and having fun and messing up and not messing up. It's really fun. So the stories are great.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you once again, everyone.
This is the bonus conversation at the end of the recording.
For those of
those
you
that have made it. Okay, everyone that's here.
To the Kepler family.
Yeah.
Let me share something I actually learned this morning. I was one of my Indian teachers was giving a talk and on the eclipses. And because I've gotten, as many of us have, a flurry of correspondence from my clients worried about the upcoming eclipse. And apparently in the Indian literature, it really does not affect the individual chart. And I know a lot of people disagree with that and say it affects them. But what it does affect, he said, is anyone whose karma influences other people. So heads of state, decision makers. And, you know, that got me thinking that if you're really worried about the eclipse hitting something in your chart, just get out of social media. Don't influence anyone. And it might pass over. So there's a little bonus teaching for those of you that stayed late.
Somebody's asking about. Oh,
I was just going to say, I heard Bernadette Brady say she was talking about eclipses, and this was just her joke. It wasn't her teaching. That the way people talk about eclipses is that something good or bad may or may not happen.
I mean, that could really be any factor.
I don't know if you all agree with that.
And that's how you get 100% accuracy with your predictions.
Kenneth, what's the name of your Mars book?
It's called, what is it called?
It's around the corner here, but I'm not going to stand up.
Somebody's asking, and
it's in Sinistry, right?
It's called Mars, Passion or Strife. It's out of print at the moment, but I'm almost done with the second edition.
Is it coming out through Moira Press?
It isn't.
Oh, okay.
It isn't coming out through Moira Press. That's the other book that I'm way.
Oh, you're doing a book with her. Okay.
Yeah, the Mars, Passion or Strife. It was it's basically on relationship astrology, the history of that, the cultural differences that come in. And it uses Mars as a focal point to demonstrate how your culture influences astrological meaning. And while also giving you a whole bunch of techniques for analyzing Mars in the context of two people.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thank you again, everyone.
So great to see
It's been wonderful having you here. So much appreciation, and to everybody who joined us today, thank you. If you missed anything, of course, it will be on our YouTube channel probably within the week.
Sometime this week. Yeah, there's a lot to go through.
Well, thanks also to all of you who do so much behind the scenes to make this so enjoyable and smooth and, you know, just, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Great.
And Demetra, thanks for sharing your time with me. I really appreciate it.
It's so fun. I miss the opportunities to be able to get together and to have these conversations.
Yeah.
It was.
I don't know, you Kepler people, you have to have like the live symposiums again.
Oh, well, hold that thought, Demetra.
What?
If only you knew a place.
Well, we are inaugurating Poly Institute soon for a gathering place for these kinds of discussions.
And thanks, Owner, for staying up late. Beaming in from Turkey.
Say something, Owner?
Yeah, it was great to come together. I see you all here. It was fantastic and great presentations and talks. So I'm very happy to be with you here. Happy Astrology Day to everyone.
Yes, indeed. You must have your own event coming up soon, do you?
Pardon?
you must have your own event coming right up.
Yeah, by the next week, we have on the 23rd and 24th, we have the 12th International Astrology Days event. It will be online on Zoom. There will be 8 speakers plus myself. I will be also managing everything. And we will be very happy if someone wants to attend. There is an information in our Astrology School's website, written in English.
Excellent.
It's there, and I can send a link. Anyone who wants to attend, and we will be very happy.
That's
Yeah,
wonderful,
for
Ona.
sure.
And that's for you, Ona, and all the rest of the speakers. If you've got any links to, I know Jen, the wonderful Cayley Institute, and Ona to event, anyone wants to send the links, I'll include them with the recordings on the channel so everyone can sign up.
Thank you. Actually, the book who I wanted to talk about, the Sadullah El-Ankaravi, it's a really great book. And it was just like a summary of Ottoman astrology. This is why I wanted to talk about that book, because it's a very, in mundane, in ingress charts, eclipse charts, electional astrology, horary astrology, natal astrology, you can find everything there. So it was just like a summary. And he was actually giving many references, many quotations from the ancient astrology. So it's a very valuable one. When we found it out in 2015, we were very surprised that so rich texts, you cannot find this kind of rich text anytime in the observatories of Istanbul. So we are very happy to find it out, and there will be some more books with this summary of his techniques, I think, in the near future. We are starting to translate them into English, I hope, very soon.
Excellent. Ona, your conference is in English?
Yes, English. The presentations will be in English, but there will be after how do you say, it's not simultaneous. I mean, the speaker is speaking just, and then there is translation.
Yeah.
So with sub translation. So someone who only speaks English, maybe it will be a bit difficult for them because they have to wait for Turkish translation. This is a big problem at the moment, but this is what people prefer. So we are still doing that. I think, again, if someone wants to attend, they can find information. Actually, I can copy or link here.
I think Lori's popped it in the chat for you, so.
Yes.
Yes. Actually, the English one, I will copy.
Wow.
Here with the announcement. Sorry, just.
It is quite a great lineup of speakers.
Yes, I will be just. How can I copy it here? Just trying to find out. And with question and answers, or
In the
I don't
chat.
know.
In the chat
I think
box.
I've already
In the
taken
chat box. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
In the chat box. Yes.
Anybody else have any astrology day events that we could grab a link?
Yeah. Actually, who will we have? We will have Cecily Hahn from Taiwan, Wade Caves from US, Margaret Wade from Ireland, Asturval Moreno Ferreira from Chile, Philip Filippo from Bulgaria, Lynn Bell from France, Ashwin Balaji Subramanian from India, Wendy Stacy from UK, and myself. So we will be 9 speakers, and the link is here.
Very international.
Yeah, very international. I hope to do the next one in Istanbul live. For this one, I couldn't make it because we have local elections by the end of this month.
Okay.
So here is very occupied and much noisy. So I didn't want to invite someone in this season.
Yeah.
Maybe next year.
Excellent.
Maybe next year.
All
Excellent.
right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right.
So,
we'll call it a day, I guess. Thank you again. And
thank you so much.
we will See you all soon.
Wonderful.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Nice to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.